Chabahar, even though it's not the most direct route, it's really the next best option for India. So the idea for India from the start has been to have this partnership with Iran so that it can create connectivity initiatives stretching from Chabahar up northward through Iran into Afghanistan and from there into Central Asia. The US chooses to try to sideline them or oppose them because of these very hostile relations that the U.S. has with certain countries. The U.S. does not want, doesn't want anyone, including India, to be engaging with Iran. And the U.S.-India relationship is much stronger and deeper than the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship. I think that the response from New Delhi would be much stronger than what we had from Dhaka.
As tensions fluctuate and alliances are tested, the Chabahar port agreement stands out as a potential game changer in India's strategic calculus, affecting its relations not just with the US and Iran, but also impacting its standing with other global powers. Today, we aim to explore what this means for the future of US India relations, the regional balance of power, and the broader geopolitical landscape. Welcome to New Wave Global. You are watching Unravel with Marvi Sirmed. We are privileged to have with us Michael Kugelman, Director of South Asia Institute at Wilson Center and a renowned expert in South Asian geopolitical strategies and the US foreign policy, to help us unpack these complexities. Michael, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Very nice to be with you here.
Thank you. So let's start by discussing the strategic importance of Chabahar Port in India's foreign policy and its significance to the region.
Right. Well, this is something that goes back quite some time, almost a decade. Some years ago, in 2016, India signed an initial agreement with Iran to develop this port in Chabahar. And of course, why is this so important strategically for India? Well, it's because India is looking for ways to access Central Asia, which is a gas-rich region where India is keen to strengthen engagement, commercial and diplomatic. But because of geography, because Pakistan borders India to the west, it's very difficult for India to use land routes to access Central Asia via Afghanistan, because you have to go through Pakistan. So Chabahar, even though it's not the most direct route, it's really the next best option for India. So the idea for India from the start has been to have this partnership with Iran so that it can create connectivity initiatives stretching from Chabahar up northward through Iran into Afghanistan and from there into Central Asia. So yeah, this has been a big priority for India for quite some time, though, the progress has been slow, quite frankly. India has not made the progress that it has wanted to make with this Chabahar project, which is why this latest deal is so important.
Yes, but most of it, because I have interviewed, our mutual friend Seema Sirohi before this, and from she was talking about, from the India's perspective, and what we discussed was that most of the slowing down was because of the US sanctions against Iran. So I'm compelled to ask you, what are the major US concerns about the deal with India, between India and Iran, about Chabahar?
Yeah, so I would argue that there are many issues in foreign policy that are there are many initiatives out there that actually could benefit American interests, but the U.S. chooses to try to sideline them or oppose them because of these very hostile relations that the U.S. has with certain countries. So, when it comes to Chabahar, I can give one or two other examples too. When you look at Chabahar, theoretically, if India works with Iran to develop this port, it could serve U.S. interests for several reasons. One is that we know that China has been getting increasingly close to Iran in recent years. A few years ago, they signed a long-term strategic partnership. China has indeed eyed possible investments in the Chabahar port. Now, with India back on the scene here, this doesn't mean that China is going to be sidelined and it won't be able to engage commercially with Iran, but clearly this is a case of India being able to counter China. That serves U.S. interest. And then if you look at the goals behind the Chabahar port, the goal is to transport, is to put India in a position to transport goods into Afghanistan, among other places. So that suggests that India would have an opportunity. It would be easier for India to convey humanitarian supplies and support into Afghanistan with this Chabahar port operational. And this serves U.S. interests as well. The U.S. supports the idea of bringing humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. But clearly it's because of the what is now a hostile relationship between the U.S. and Iran. It compels the U.S. to look at this differently. The other example I'd highlight here is India's arms deal with Russia for an S-400 package, which is a missile defense system.
Yes.
India has not said publicly what it intends to use the S-400 for. Many Pakistanis think it would be used against them potentially, but I think there's a good reason to believe that India would use the S-400 to strengthen its capacity to deter China on its northern border. And if that's the case, that would serve U.S. interest. But because of the nature of the U.S. relationship with Russia, the U.S. doesn't want anyone doing any type of business, military or commercial, with the Russians. Now, the U.S. has been willing to provide sanctions waivers to many of its friends, including India. And as you know, after India signed its previous deal with Iran on the Chabahar port project, the U.S. actually provided a sanctions waiver.
That's right.
So what Seema said is correct, that India's concerns about violating U.S. sanctions is a reason why there's been this slowdown. But there was that one waiver that the U.S. gave to India, though that was some years ago. It was 2018. And I think India understandably worries that it's different. And certainly, given how things are now, the U.S. relationship with Iran is a lot worse now than it was in 2018, suggesting that we can't rule out the possibility that the U.S. would want to sanction India. Highly unlikely, but again, the nature of the U.S.-Iran relationship is just very hostile right now.
Yeah, that's right. But how far U.S.-Israel strategic partnership is reflected here? Do you
Well, I
think
mean,
it's informed by U.S.-Israel relations as well?
I think that at this point, the U.S.-Israel relationship has become very different from how it was pre-October 7th. I mean, it's clear that the U.S. has tried to back Israel as much as it can, but we're starting to see some strain, given that the U.S. has not been able to get Israel to show the level of restraint that it has wanted it to. But I don't think that relationship and U.S. calculations about its relationship with Israel really impacts its thinking about Chabahar and India and what India is trying to do. Yeah, I think that from India's perspective, that keeping in mind the Israel issue, this Chabahar port project, I think, is another foreign policy success story for India, which has been able to so remarkably frequently balance its relations with different friends that are rivals with each other, right? India has a growing relationship with Israel,
That's
but
right.
it has a pretty close relationship with Iran, which has suffered a bit in recent years, especially as India some years ago stopped importing oil from Iran because of the U.S. sanctions regime. But the U.S. has kept India has kept its relationship with Iran in a pretty good plane. So the fact that it has these good relations with both Israel and Iran, given everything that's happening in the Middle East right now, I think that's testament to India's foreign policy successes, non-alignment, strategic autonomy, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, but then that begets the question, why now? Why U.S. State Department's deputy spokesperson, Mr. Patel, indicated the risk of sanctions at this point in time when USA had already extended exceptions to India in 2018 before in the US-Afghanistan deal that was to be signed in 2021 later. And after that, what is USA thinking? Why even indicate such a drastic risk that I think even USA would not want to pose?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of the timing, the simple answer to the question is that the U.S. official was asked specifically by a journalist what he thought of the India deal with Iran. And so he then, there was that prompt. It's not like the US, as a matter of policy, decided to make this statement that, any entity could runs the risk of sanctions. It was a response to a specific question from a journalist. But I think that another reason why he responded in the way he did goes back to what I said before, that the U.S.-Iran relationship is about as bad as it could be right now. And I think that, U.S. officials may not be in as much of a mood to be, to be charitable, so to speak, in terms of being willing to provide waivers without thinking through the process in a big way. And even when it comes to a close partner like India,
Yeah.
the U.S. does not want doesn't want anyone, including India, to be engaging with Iran. And I think that it's difficult for India to be flexible here. Or not, it's difficult for India to adjust this deal in a way that it wouldn't provoke the biggest risk of sanctions, in that the idea is to develop the port, right? This is not like, you take things to Pakistan. A lot of talk about whether Pakistan's plan to build the pipeline to Iran would provoke U.S. sanctions. Pakistan could build its part of the pipeline, but so long as you don't actually, so long as it doesn't start actually importing gas or sending energy through, it wouldn't run the risk of sanctions. But India, this is a story of, if you're developing the port, money is being expended. You're having a commercial partnership in that regard. So yeah, I think that what India is banking on is that it's engaged in some other potentially sanctionable behavior over the last few years. Its initial deal with Chabahar, the S-400 deal with Russia, its continued imports of Russian oil. And in no case has it been sanctioned, and it has received a waiver. I think it's also banking on its strategic partnership with the U.S. So I think it's banking on all that. And I can't imagine the U.S. sanctioning India for this, but I
Yeah.
don't think it's going to be as easy as some in New Delhi may think it is to get that waiver, just because as long as the Middle East continues to be on fire, and so long as Iran continues to engage in the way it has, so long as it continues to back these proxies, it's going to make it very difficult for the U.S. to want to be benevolent, so to speak, and be willing to give the benefit of the doubt to countries, even close friends, that are engaging very directly with
Yeah.
with Iran, even if that serves U.S. interests for the reasons I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. And that's, what was more worrying was the next question of the journalist who asked Mr. Vedant Patel, will the past exceptions that were given to India vis-a-vis Chabahar port be extended? And the answer was no. This was worrying. And then how do you see it? If the exceptions
Yeah,
are not being given and the sanctions are not, sanctions are too drastic a step, what could happen? Could this impact other areas of cooperation?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, it's just a statement. I mean, it's not an expression of policy. And the U.S. U.S. officials have said things that ended up not being the case. And if you
Yeah.
think back to when the war in Ukraine began, you had, I can't remember what his name was, but you had another U.S. official who essentially said that we can't rule out sanctions for India because of its engagements with Russia. And it was a huge story in India, and there was all this concern and all this all this talk of, oh, we can't trust our American partners, and they're going to come back at us. But nothing, we know what happened. The U.S. did back off eventually. So,
Yeah.
I think this might have been a desire on the part of this official and the U.S. government just to make sure that India is not complacent about this. Now, some might argue, well, we've seen that the U.S.-India relationship has experienced a bit of turbulence in recent months,
Mm.
mainly because of the extrajudicial killing allegations against the Indian government, as according to the indictment that was unsealed last year. I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think the U.S. officials, they want to see the relationship work with India. They certainly know that if there were to be sanctions slapped on India, that could have implications for the relationship. So my bottom line is that we shouldn't read too much into what this U.S. official said in his responses to the journalist. I think that his main goal was just to make it clear that no one, in theory, no one is immune to this, and India has to recognize that there are certain possibilities. But I think when it comes time for the U.S. to think of this through and to undertake the the policy review about whether you have sanctions or not, and when they have engagements with the Indian counterparts, there's going to be a lot of focus on how well we want to make this work. How can we make this work? It may not be possible to make it work in a way that India can do what it wants to do without getting sanctioned. But I think that the U.S. does not want this Chabahar issue to become a problem for the U.S.-India relationship.
Yes, but but at the same time, US does not want India to be complacent about it, and US is not tolerant of too many friends of Iran. So, what can be the potential consequence if India totally ignores this warning of risks by the US? What can happen?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, the initial signpost is we have to see that this new agreement is operationalized, right? I mean, these things take a long time. But
Yeah.
once it becomes clear to the US that India is following through, that it has a presence in Chabahar, the capital and technology and equipment and so on are being deployed, yeah, that's when I think you would have a process. I mean, within the U.S. government, you have a very formal process that takes place when you look very closely at what the country is doing. What does this mean in terms of how you measure the sanctions regime and all of that, and then they'll reach a conclusion as to whether what India is doing is worthy of a waiver or not. If you have the worst case scenario from the perspective of both countries and the sanctions are imposed, well, I mean, it's been a few years. It's been quite a few years since India had to deal with U.S. sanctions, right? And so, given how rapidly this relationship has strengthened over the last few decades, yeah, I think that could be quite devastating for the relationship. Just, in any of these other cases, if the U.S. had sanctioned India for the S-400 deal with Russia, if it had sanctioned India for its commercial engagements with Russia, the earlier Chabahar work, it would have been tough. But I think that now there's a bit more at stake because of the fact that you have this not little, you have these tensions in the relationship because of the Panun case, the extrajudicial killings issue. That's sort of looming over there. But
Yeah.
the other reason why there's more at stake is that great power competition is especially intense now, and I think that the U.S. really wants to bank on partnering with India in that context to counter China. So it would be terrible, I think, for both countries. The biggest winner from that would be Iran, of course. Iran would love to see a critical
Yeah.
U.S. relationship fall apart or suffer major damage. But
Or maybe Pakistan. Another winner would be Pakistan and China, maybe.
Yep, absolutely.
So, um, I mean, as I said, sanction seems too drastic a step. So, if there is, for example, there's a change in cooperation in other areas like tech or the trade, um, in that case, how would it impact the region? Not just India, but the region.
Right. So I think the first part of your question prompts an interesting point. I think an interesting caveat that different countries react differently to being sanctioned, right? The US not too long ago sanctioned Bangladesh, as you know, for its one of its major paramilitary organizations for human rights violations.
Mm.
And it was a problem. Obviously, it wasn't received well by Dhaka, but the relationship was not impacted in a big way. And just this past week, Donald Lu, the top we all know who Donald Lu, the top South Asia official at the State Department, he had a very successful visit to Dhaka where he was talking about strengthening strategic partnership, commercial relations, and all of that. The Bangladeshi government wants to work with the US, and yeah, they're concerned about the RAB sanctions. They're trying to deal with the problem. But that's different. I think with India, the reaction may be a bit different. Even though the US-India relationship is much stronger and deeper than the US-Bangladesh relationship, I think that the response from New Delhi would be much stronger than what we had from Dhaka. And so would that mean now, of course, also, we don't know what types of sanctions there would be. If, again, we suspend our disbelief and assume the unlikely that there are sanctions, we don't know what they would look like, how harsh they would be, and so on. But I think that India would not necessarily want to halt all forms of partnership with the US. I certainly think that it would have impacts on certain forms of cooperation, but I think the broader issue is the impact on perceptions in the relationship. And we know that in Washington now, there are US officials, particularly those that work on the security and the intel side with India, those involved in the intelligence sharing, the tech transfers. I think that there's been a hit to trust in the sense of, oh, well, India did this on our soil, what could happen next? So I think that if you have sanctions on India, they have the response, the perceptions in India would be, oh, well, they're willing to sanction a strategic partner. So that I think could impact not necessarily specific types of engagement, but the broader way in which the two sides go about in engaging. So, but I don't want to speculate too much because we don't know, even if there are sanctions, which is unlikely, we
That's
don't
right.
know what they would look like, how serious they'd be.
Absolutely. So we can just hope for for better sense that that must prevail, because the region is already quite volatile, with so much happening between India and China right now, and within Pakistan, in both the sides of the Kashmir line of control. There is unrest, there are elections in India, so on and so forth, and amidst the current conflict in the Middle East ongoing. So the world cannot take another kind of crisis that these sanctions might prove to. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. And just one more point on that. I mentioned this briefly before. Another reason why we could think that the US will not sanction India is looking at how India drastically changed its commercial relationship with Iran some years ago, where it was a heavy importer of oil, energy from Iran. It basically drew those imports down to zero very quickly. And it's compensated by scaling up its energy relations with Saudi Arabia, which is very interesting, along with countries like Iraq and Qatar and so on. I think that the U.S. recognizes that. That was a case of India being mindful of U.S. concerns about Iran, and I think would make it clear to U.S. officials that India is not trying to mock the U.S. sanctions regime on Iran. And the argument that India would make is that, whenever we do things like this, whether it was with Iran or Russia, it's to serve key Indian economic interest, or in some cases strategic interest. But I do think that India's record vis-a-vis its energy trade with Iran, that's something that still is appreciated and recognized by U.S. officials now.
Yeah. So in nutshell, we're saying that although it's quite complex, there are varying interests, and there are US concerns as well. But the sanctions are too drastic a step to take at this stage. And we hope that nothing of this sort happens, but we will watch keenly the developments that are happening. So thank you very much. And with that, our show comes to an end tonight. Thank you very much, viewers, for tuning in. Stay tuned, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop standing up for the right thing. Good night.